Welcome everybody to this Black All Year event. It's slightly delayed. We had to reschedule. If you've missed previous events, just to say they are available on YouTube and they're also available as a podcast. You can access them on www.blackallyear.co.uk. So if you're watching or listening to this after event, if you can like and subscribe, it'll make sure that you don't miss any future material, and it also helps others to find the content as well. So it's quite ironic, really, that this has been rescheduled to October, which is Black History Month, because Black All Year came about because of Black History Month and the fact that every single year I was being asked to talk about leadership, about racism, about being a Black woman, all that type of thing. And I would be really, really busy in October, and then nobody wanted to talk about it the rest of the year. And I've seen similar stuff actually on Twitter over the last couple of days. And it really frustrated me because if you're Black all year round. So what I did was I created these events, and we've had about 6 or 7 now. We've also had some podcast only material as well. So it's going really well, and I really hope that you're enjoying the series. I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome our guest. Anybody who is even vaguely interested in diversity, inclusion and racial equity in the NHS will have heard of Roger Kline. And so I was really keen to ask him if he would take part, and I was delighted and honoured when you agreed, Roger. For anyone that doesn't know, Roger is a research fellow at Middlesex University Business School. He was the author of The Snowy White Peaks of the NHS, which has been commonly shortened to Snowy White Peaks, and I think it's almost a hashtag now. And that was in 2014. He was also co-author of The Price of Fear, which was on the cost of bullying in the NHS, and co-author of Fair to Refer on the disproportionate referrals of some groups and doctors to the General Medical Council. And Roger's also very active on Twitter and very well respected. I think maybe even a little feared by NHS leadership, Roger.
No, so I'm a cuddly pussycat.
But you are very, very welcome. So thank you, and thank you for being so accommodating with the rescheduling as well because of the Queen's funeral. So Roger, obviously the NHS is a huge employer anyway, but as was pointed out to me on Twitter by somebody who thought they were making a point that they weren't, it's also the biggest employer of Black and minority ethnic staff. So why has somewhere that has such a huge employee base found it so hard to make progress on equality at work?
So there's 3 or 4 bits in answer. I'm going to spend most of my time on one of them, but just very briefly, we live in a society where racism is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It affects sexism, affects us. Homophobia is all around us. Disabled staff and citizens is really awful. And it affects us literally from the cradle to the grave. But that doesn't explain why the NHS has failed to get to grips with this when it's so obviously, it's the largest employer of people of Black and minority ethnic heritage. It's huge, it has the resources, and it has not really moved the dial. So I think there's 2 small reasons. They're big reasons, but they're not the core reason I want to talk about. One is that there's been a culture of avoidance and denial. If I can find it, I've got a quote here from Robert Francis, who said, if I can find it, if I can't, don't worry. Basically, he said, the NHS prefers to avoid difficult issues and engages in, there's an institutional instinct of denial. And he was talking about patient care in his mid-stats report a decade ago. And he went on to talk about We prefer messages that are uplifting and show progress rather than others. It's what Mary Dixon Woods called comfort seeking rather than problem seeking. So there's a real problem there, and I can give you loads of examples where I've walked into boards and said things and I get a look of just astonishment. For example, I said, you've got one board, I said, you've got a real problem with the bullying of BME staff in this organization. And the HR director said, well, that's what the staff survey says. He says, but we've had no grievances. I said, well, you've got a double problem then, haven't you? Not only people being bullied, 39% being bullied, but nobody, they're fearful of the consequences. I think it's a waste of time. So there's an issue of avoidance and denial. The second one is we find it really hard to talk about. I'm white. White people find it really difficult to talk honestly about race. And we're terrified of saying the wrong thing in case it upsets you, or we might inadvertently put our foot in it and say something that might be seen as racist. So we kind of basically avoid the subject altogether. But of course, people spot this straight away, say it's a conversational car crash with real consequences because it affects feedback from interviews, appraisals, and especially entry into the disciplinary process, which I'll talk about, because if you can't have an honest conversation, you'll say, we'll get someone to investigate.
And so, that's it, isn't it? That discomfort with talking about race means that people either get really clumsy or they just ignore it completely, and it just makes things worse. Yeah, go on.
No, there's an American author, David Thomas, who writing about this. He calls it protective hesitancy. And he was talking about mentorship, how the mentorship experience of BME students was different to the mentorship experience of staff, rather, was different to that of white people. So with BME staff, this is America, it was very technical, lots of technical skills. Whereas with white people, it's much more about socializing, raising profile, networking, etc., which of course are quite different outcomes in terms of your career trajectory. So that's the second one. The third one, which is the one I'd really kind of I focused on more, is we've had a kind of paradigm of policies, procedures, and training. We've said that if we put in place the right policies, procedures, and training, that should move the dial on all forms of discrimination. There's no evidence base for this whatsoever. Indeed, the evidence exists, says that if you rely on policies and procedures in isolation, they will make no difference. There's a paper for ACAS by Justin Eveson. And if you rely on training, there's a really brilliant paper by Carlin and Dobbin from the States, who looked at 708 companies who are doing affirmative action. And they found that the least effective way of improving the proportion of women and people of color in more senior grades was diversity training. The least effective. Similarly, Doyen Atualagan, who I've worked with, when she did her piece for the EHRC, which is a literary review, found training, diversity training and unconscious bias training can improve your understanding, your cognitive understanding, but there's almost no evidence it significantly affects decision making. So we've used a model. I mean, I sometimes say it's a bit like people going into the kind of London Underground using a map of the Paris Metro, and then we're surprised we get lost. And so there's lots of activity, but you know, we haven't answered the question. If you were a nursing director and you went to the board, there's an outbreak of MRSA, you would expect to be asked the question, could you tell us why what you're proposing to do has a reasonable likelihood of succeeding? And if you can't, people say, why are we doing it? Finance director, the same. We don't do that with EDI.
And I do hear that a lot, actually, of the, well, we're doing a lot and we're putting in a lot of effort and we're seeing some small changes, but it's just not good enough. And yet nobody seems to think, well, maybe we should be doing something different. It's just, well, we'll just do more. If we do more, we'll see a bigger change. It's that whole kind of definition of insanity thing, isn't it? That people think all of a sudden they're going to get a different result by doing exactly the same thing, but just more.
So fortunately, I do think there's a bit of change, and maybe it's the innate optimism in me. But I do see some change in two senses. One, first of all, when I go into boards, I am much less likely to be asked, why is this important? And much more likely to be asked, what should we be doing? How do we tackle it? And secondly, there is now some evidence that people can't ignore that what we're doing isn't working and that there's a better way of doing it. And I just done a piece of work, a sort of review of recruitment and career progression in the NHS for NHS England, which is based on the piece of work I did called No More Tick Boxes. But it might be helpful if you thought it was useful to talk about why discipline is a really good example of how you should use a different approach. Yeah. So the things that research tells us make a difference when it comes to culture and especially to EDI are three main things. What does the leadership do? Does the leadership understand the issue? Is it personally committed to change? Does it understand the narrative about why it should be a core part of the business case? And do they model the behaviors they expect of others? If all four criteria are not met, it's really hard to move the dial. There's lots of research on that. If they are, you can then start to look at the two other criteria that need to be met. One is much less focus on training and much more focus on debiasing processes. I'll give an example in a moment. And thirdly, and crucially, inserting accountability, which doesn't mean beating people up all the time, but it does mean holding people to account and using that to drive improvement. If I may give an example, Steph, disciplinary action. For years, first of all, we were in denial there was a problem. The numbers were too small. I kept being told by trusts and drawing conclusions. Then when I said, but all trusts have the same pattern, so there's a problem. Now it's part of the res. But what we've tended to do is improve the training, try and get better investigators, stick BME people on panels, and it still hasn't made much difference. And then about 4 years ago, quite separately, myself and Amanda Oates, who is HR director at now Chief People Officer at Mersey Care, quite separately came to similar conclusions using a different evidence base. And what I managed to persuade a couple of the big teaching hospitals in London to do was to introduce a protocol which said, if you're a manager and you want to discipline anybody, black, white, male, female, you have to explain to somebody at board level why that's the appropriate response to what has happened or is alleged to have happened. Mm-hmm. Because if you can't demonstrate learning trumps punishment, and you're teaching people that you're treating people the same irrespective of their background, why are you doing it? And in the last 4 years, the number of people being disciplined in the NHS has dropped by 36%. And the gap between the likelihood that BME people and white people will enter the disciplinary process has been radically reduced. And it's now just 1.12 times more likely that BME people will enter the process rather than white. There's still things to do. And in some cases, managers have tried to find other ways of punishing BME people, but the data doesn't lie. And that's because if you insert an accountability nudge by saying you can't do that unless you could put in writing why you think that's a good idea, what it seems to have done is lots of managers, in the words of a chief nurse in one of the teaching hospitals I spoke to initially, they stopped trying to do it because they didn't want to put in right the foolishness that they were using to justify sending someone off to an investigation. And of course, once you send someone into an investigation, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They wouldn't be there if they weren't guilty of something. Yeah. We tend to ignore evidence that doesn't prove the hypothesis we think we're working on and attach great importance to anything that looks like a case on the news this morning, a terrible death of a 6-year-old. Exactly the same thing happened within the police. So inserting an accountability nudge, a bias interrupter, if you like, works much more effectively than putting, for example, a BME person on the panel to hear a case which shouldn't even be there in the first place. Yeah. And you can apply same kind of methodology to recruitment and career progression. That's what I've tried to do in No More Tick Boxes. I could talk about it later if you think.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really interesting on a couple of counts. So first of all, disappointing, but perhaps not surprised that it wasn't that a senior leader was then saying this is inappropriate. It was that people actually worked out for themselves it was inappropriate, but would have gone ahead with it anyway. So it's not that they didn't have that knowledge. It's just having that level of accountability and someone checking your homework has made people pause and reflect and then go, yeah, actually, this isn't the right thing to do. So you kind of go, that's just, it's so frustrating that that's what's needed to make people do the right thing. But also I think the fact that for so many, the solution for so many things seems to be, well, we need a diverse panel. We need to make sure there is a brown person on the board, there's a brown person on the panel. That's really important that we do that. And before we started, we were just having a brief discussion about why that's not as effective as it might initially seem to be. This idea of having a Black person on an interview panel, for example, why does that not work? Why does it not make a difference?
Well, you could look the other way around. Why do people think it would work? So the research on this is pretty mixed, and it applies to gender as well as ethnicity. There is no solid research evidence that having diverse panels will necessarily give you better outcomes. So I'm not against them. In fact, I'm in favour of them. In the same way that I'm in favour of boards being diverse for all sorts of well-evidenced reasons. But if you only have, so there's a lovely piece of work looking at women on boards, Norwegian piece of research, which is regarded as the sort of pretty much the gold standard on this. It was only when there were 3 women on Norwegian boards that they started to make a real difference to the way the board worked. Mm-hmm. One person, and it's a bit, so one person on their own, what will happen is you get stereotyped. Oh, you're on the board, Steph. I bet you're expected to be the person who leads on EDI and especially on race. Are you? Yeah. So what's everybody else doing? Why? Because you're brown? Is that might be you want to, but actually the assumption is you will somehow be the person who wants to drive this and are probably an expert. Not necessarily the case. So I know, for example, when NHS England put BME people on panels in their big restructure recently, I am told reliably it made a difference of 0.6% to the proportion of BME people appointed. So I'm not against it. It didn't do any harm, but it really didn't do much good. It can make people more comfortable when they walk in. But sometimes women and BME people on panels actually hold people like them to a higher standard. Mm. They don't want to be seen as favouring people who are different, who look like them. So there are other things you can do that are much more effective. And anybody that's wading through no tick boxes will know the sorts of things they are.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of hit on a real thing there. In that if you are the only person of difference on that board, then there's a number of real challenges. So you have to feel safe to speak up, which is a big deal. So, you're on an interview panel, all the panelists think one way, you think another way. Actually having that ability and that confidence and that psychological safety to speak up, it is a big deal. But you're absolutely right. They'll say, well, we've got somebody on the board who is Black, and therefore they understand absolutely everything about every ethnicity on the earth. And not just that, but sexual orientation, gender, disability. Because of the melanin in our skin, we're supposed to be experts on everything. We're absolute nonsense. And it's almost, I don't know why people won't speak up when there is a Black person on the board about things that are obviously not right. You don't have to be an EDI expert to spot some of this stuff. And yet it's almost like, maybe it goes back to this discomfort that white people have talking about race, but actually it's almost like, I don't feel like I can say something because you're the representative.
So it's really, so there's with race, the sort of technical phrase that's used is protective hesitancy.
Mhm.
It happens with gender too. So I've been told by numerous women about their appraisals and their feedback from interviews is much softer and much more vague than it is for men. So as often happens with BME colleagues, after an interview, you ask us the feedback. What are you told? Well, you were pretty good on the day, Steph, but somebody else on the day was better. Absolutely useless. Whereas what would happen with a bloke is much more likely to be if it was me. Okay, Roger, you were good in the interview, but your presentation was rubbish. So what we're going to do is we're going to get you to talk to Fred about how to beef up your presentations. People, some men are still anxious about being direct and honest with women about these things. And it's much more a case with white people and BME people. And it's partly influenced by, we don't really understand how deep and how powerful bias is. So the point about debiasing is there's the evidence that training deals with bias is pretty thin. You have to actually debias the specific processes that prompt it, enable it, and then insert accountability just as a reminder, really, to say, don't do it. Or if you do, you have to explain yourself, because people who are watched and scrutinized change their behaviors. I'm sure your children do it.
Yeah.
Mine occasionally did. All of us, if we watch, we change our behaviors.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, can we go back to the what you were saying about disciplinary processes, because there's quite a lot of interest in the chat, and if anybody would like to come on and discuss this, then you're more than welcome to. But actually, this real disparity between disciplinary processes for people who are Black and ethnically minoritized compared to white colleagues is a real issue. And I know that for medics, the paper that you did about referrals through to the GMC and the like. So the example that you were giving, you said it's a couple of trusts that have taken this new approach. Is that right?
Well, I think now majority of trusts in one form or another, one I spoke at this morning, have realised NHS is a funny kind of thing. There's a lot of herd mentality. At the beginning, it was really hard to persuade people to do this. It looked risky. There was a lot of pushback from managers. Are you undermining my right to decide who should be investigated? Now, if you're not doing something like this, you look a bit like a kind of, you're an outsider. So I think there is progress there, but it will only be sustainable if leaderships in the organization understand why it's working and the importance of doing it, because what happens around discipline is symptomatic of all the other things that happen to groups that are disadvantaged within the NHS, not just BME people. So that understanding is really important if it's to be sustainable, but you need the kind of the debiasing, the bias interrupters, and the accountability. And the accountability is particularly either in the way I've suggested or data driven. So you can say something's going on in these states. Why are they getting many more people disciplined? And you sit down with people, you say, look, this is what the data shows. Is there a good reason why it's happening? Because there might be, unlikely, but there might be. And if there isn't, we're going to change it. We'll help you to change. And if there's pushback, it becomes a KPI. It becomes something that becomes mandated. But I'm in favor of trying to start with an improvement lens, but with people being clear that if that doesn't work, other things will happen. I think that's research. If you can get the frontline managers on board, much better to do it that way. If you can't, it's going to happen anyway.
Yeah. And I think that there is that the only flaw I can see in things being referred up to senior leadership is it means that you need the senior leadership that are actually going to spot that this is inappropriate. And that, again, boards are quite reflective in some ways of the organisation. And therefore, there's no guarantee that they're going to turn around. And I suppose that's why there is still that gap in those trusts.
So I'm looking at Evelyn. Hi, Evelyn. I've never met you, but we swap messages on Twitter. So I'm looking at your comment, which is absolutely spot on, that in London, bizarrely, London, which has the highest proportion of BME staff in the country, has the worst record on all res indicators. I mean, that alone makes it worthwhile having res indicators. What on earth is going on there? And the comparison with East of England is a really good one, because the leadership in East of England, and that was the region that published no more tick boxes, because NHS England naturally wouldn't publish it. They are committed, I think, to work on this. And there's been a concerted drive, probably not in all trusts, but across the region, to try and improve these sorts of things. So leadership needs to understand it's not for those who are disadvantaged by discrimination to lead the charge in responding to it. It's for the leadership of the organization to put measures in place that enable them to know what's going on and to react in a preventative, proactive, I call it a sort of public health approach. Because otherwise, individuals, quite rightly, are reluctant to raise concerns, either because they think it won't make any difference or because they think it'll make things worse. And they're right in many cases. So leadership needs to, talk about making it safe for people to raise concerns is only one bit of it. Why isn't the leadership intervening so people don't even need to raise concerns? You should know. If I'm a medical director, I pretty much know every single doctor who is remotely an outlier in my workforce. Why don't we do the same thing on EDI?
Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that I find quite interesting, actually, is that even when you've got the best will boards that are there can quite often be a disconnect between what the board is trying to do and then what we see at that middle and junior management level. Is that about accountability, that there's no accountability for not taking the correct actions?
It's a good question. So I think we don't understand how deep. So first of all, I distinguish between racists and racism. So racists are they're nasty, but they're relatively easier to deal with. Trusts, not all trusts on the whole are a bit clearer what they should do with overt racists compared to racism, which is the much more subtle ways. So I always use, if I may give 3 examples of bias in recruitment. And when people were challenged about it, they said, really? When one piece of research looked at why were more men being appointed than women? What they discovered was when men had more experience, they were appointed because they had more experience. But when men had more education than women, they were appointed because they had more education. And when people had this thrown at them, they really? The second one was around black managers. The fact that black managers, it was more likely to be assumed that they got to where they were because of help from other people compared to white managers, and people were really defensive when this was put to them. And the third one was with people's evaluation. So BME and women's evaluation of themselves compared to other people was poorer, and they overstated the abilities of other people. So a bit of imposter syndrome or something going on there. There's lots and people make assumptions if you're a mum in the way that they don't if you're a dad. Etc. If you're a dad and you mention children in an interview, well, what a nice rounded character he is. If you're a mum, it's like, so who's going to care for him? Or even more, is she planning to have any more?
Yeah. And I think that kind of thing is even more so if you are black and female, because it's obviously then you're caring for all of your entire family and all of your extended family, because there are these assumptions that are made about the way in which you function, the way your life works.
So being clear if you're clear about the leadership, You know, what leaders do or don't do largely sets the culture in an organization. You then have to focus on the other two things, which are debiasing processes and inserting accountability. And there are lots of practical. So with discipline, the way to debias the process is stop. You can't go further unless you can explain what you're doing. It's a mixture of debiasing and accountability. With recruitment, you need to look at each stage and think through, how does the bias creep in? So I often use the example of NHS job descriptions are kind of enormous. All these 53 things you have to be able to do. That won't necessarily deter somebody like me as an old white man, because I'm not bothered if I can't do everything on the job description, because I'll kind of learn it as I'll go along and probably discover that half the things you don't have to do anyway. But if you're a woman, or even more, if you're a black woman, you're going to think, I know I'm going to be held to a higher standard. I have to be confident I can do all the things there. Otherwise, I run the risk of at some point hitting the buffers. So, as research shows, men are less bothered about long lists of things. Women and BME staff, for very good reasons, are more reluctant to apply for those sorts of things. So there's answers. You can do things to do. Similarly, if you have your typical interview, which consists of 3 people in a hurry having a quick look at shortlisting, and then somebody cooks up some questions, nobody has any idea what a good answer, a poor answer, or an average answer looks like. Never mind scoring them. Even if you do, you don't keep to it in a rigorous way. And at the end, if the person you thought was best, because they were the kind of, best at selling snow to the Eskimos, didn't get the highest score, somebody will say, well, you know what? I know Steph didn't have a brilliant interview. This won't happen to you, by the way. I know Steph didn't have a brilliant interview, but I've seen her in action. She's great, So never mind the scores, let's appoint her. And there's a lovely piece of work that says panels confuse confidence and competence. And that particularly favors some groups of people. And related to that, think about how influential is the future line manager intending to choose people a bit like him or her, people they think will fit in. How do we know that's really important? There's lots of research that says that. But in the NHS, we have examples where the future line manager wasn't part of the decision process, and those who were appointed were much more diverse than would have been the case when the future line manager was involved. There's several big examples. I've written one of them up, which is about nurse recruitment. And when I say this in trust, they say, oh, yeah, that's what happened when, Roger was off and the interview went ahead and we were really surprised you got appointed.
And yet that is almost the opposite of what normally happens. I mean, I've sat in discussions where we've been recruiting a new manager, and it's kind of, well, we can't recruit their direct reports until we've got that manager in place so they can be involved in the interview process. So now you say it makes perfect sense, but it's just not the way that we've done things in the past. And interesting, going back to what you were saying about when you have a Black person on a panel, interview panel, for example, and that not wanting to be seen to favour people who look like them. And, doing a bit of soul searching myself, have I actually done that? And I think I've certainly had that discussion with myself about, am I favouring this person because they're like me, or am I scoring them fairly based on the way they presented?
Sorry.
And I was just going to say, but actually, I suspect that my white colleagues do not have that same conversation with themselves.
And one of the things that might affect what you do is you don't want to give your white colleagues or your male colleagues, because the same to some degree applies to women, the impression that in any way you're doing any favors for someone because they look like you. So there's a kind of, and of course there's a small minority of people who pull the ladder up, but that's a minority. But certainly that's why it doesn't make that much difference. It will do sometimes. It's made worse if the person who's different, the independent person on the panel, is junior, because they're really going to think twice about the consequences of challenging.
I must admit, I did hear about a panel, quite a senior role, where somebody was brought in as the Black person to be on the panel, but wasn't allowed to be part of the decision making.
That's
so
quite
sit on the panel, ask questions, but at the point where they're then discussing it, they then left, and that was the end of their role. And you kind of think, well, what's the point then? What is that? That box ticking, just extreme on another level, that one.
Or ask questions, but not allowed to vote.
Yeah.
I've had that too.
Yeah. Just crazy. In terms of some of this, so we've had some comments about the fact that boards don't reflect the workforce, and particularly in London, but I think elsewhere as well. As we said at the beginning, the NHS is very ethnically diverse, and normally more diverse, apart from in London, more diverse than the local population. And yet we don't see boards that reflect their workforce. How do we do that? And how do we get away from this? Well, we'll bring in some non-exec directors who are Black. Because non-exec directors are great, and one, we've got a fantastic role to play and all that type of thing. However, it's not the same.
And of course, what the RES data shows is there's been a significant improvement in the number of women and BME directors on boards. Very significant compared to when I wrote the Snow White Peaks. But although the number of exec directors at that level who are different has improved a bit, there isn't really a pipeline behind it. That's for a number of reasons. I think it's partly because we don't really have a talent management strategy in the NHS. There's no proper succession planning informed by inclusion. There's no deep understanding of all the talent that's wasted, or of the fact that inclusive team. So even if you increase representation, unless the group, the team, the board you are joining is inclusive, welcomes your difference, realizes you add something to the conversation, makes it psychologically safe for you to say, hang on a minute, actually adding a woman or a BME person to a board won't necessarily make any difference. On the contrary, might mean that people feel marginalized, disengaged. And although I haven't got any data on this, my sense is there's a higher turnover of BME people at very high levels, very senior levels in the NHS, because they are effectively disenfranchised at that very senior. So as well as it being harder to get there, once you do get there, unless the board of the team or the SMT are really inclusive, you're going to think, people aren't really listening. I don't get called to speak quite as often. People don't take quite as much notice of what I say. I don't really get asked to go off and kind of lead projects and so on. You pick it up, and usually people pick it up rightly. So the only way around it, as far as I'm concerned, is right. We know that diverse, inclusive teams are more effective. There's a very solid evidence base to that. We know there's loads of talent that's not being tapped in the NHS. Let's have a strategy that says we're going to identify where the blockages are, not just through positive action, but by removing the institutional blockages. I'm very critical of trusts that put loads of energy into positive action, but it's still twice as likely that a white person be appointed for shortlisting. So what on earth was the point of the positive action? You have to do both. So stretch opportunities, for example, are key to development. A sort of piece of low-hanging fruit is that every organization should remove the line manager from the decision about who is going to act up, who is going to get secondment, who's going to be involved in projects. Increasing number of trusts are now using talent pools and assessment centers to pull in people who want development, and then they allocate them. It's the same thing about removing line manager affinity bias, and to a large degree can address the sort of tap on the shoulder. So that's a very simple thing. Everybody do it. Why don't people look at what the outcomes of appraisals are? Appraisals ought to be a key stage in people's development. Most of them are perfunctory, and where they're scored, I've not seen a trust where they're scored where BME people don't come off worst.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that that the trust that I'm a non-exec, so Newcastle Hospitals have done, which I was actually really proud of, is that they put in place a leadership program for ethnically minoritized staff. They didn't have an entry banding on that.
Yeah.
Recognizing the fact that actually, if you say you've got to be band 6 before you can get to this, you're excluding a whole load of talent who are just never going to get to band 6 because of all the issues that we're aware of. So they've had it's been a leadership program that has been about leadership, not about ethnicity. But it's been some of that leadership has been discussed in the context of being Black or ethnically minoritized. The follow-up to that is the thing that I'm now pushing on, because actually you're exactly right. It's that, okay, so we've identified and invested in some people here who have had real training, and they all had a change project to do. And I was at the first report out from the first cohort, some really fantastic stuff done alongside doing a leadership course and their day job. So what next? How do we make sure that those people are mentored appropriately? How do we give them those stretch opportunities? And that, I think, is the bit that's quite often missing, that happens perhaps informally, if you're white.
It does. So I think it's somebody's put in there that who it's Evelyn actually, who makes a referral to the talent pool. The organisations that I know about it, you self-refer. You ask to go into the talent pool. You're then assessed by people who are not your line managers, assessed by people who realise that in particular, it's not exclusively for people from underrepresented groups, but in particular, we want people from staff groups who are underrepresented in the more senior bands of the organisation to join it. If the referral is done by the line manager, they can easily be blockers. And I've forgotten your question.
It was about the fact that actually a lot of the networks, the mentoring, the access to stretch opportunities is informal, done informally if you're white, and we have to formalize that to make sure it happens for Black people.
One of the ways of formalizing it is by inserting accountability. So particularly in terms of the end products. So the best trusts, I'm working on one at the moment, is developing a real-time database linked to the RES and eventually the WDES metrics, which will enable the board leadership, who I think are committed to doing this, to be able to identify where the outliers are within the organization to start with, either the bits that are much better or the bits that are much worse, and to sit down with them and say, Steph, we've looked at your data on appointments. You keep appointing, much more likely that men will be appointed than women. Can you talk us through, or BME white staff rather, can you talk us through this? There might be a really good reason for it. Can you tell us what it is? Because there is no good reason generally. So fine. So we will help you. We will come up with solutions that will help you deal with this, debiasing and accountability solutions. If you push back, it's going to become a KPI. Mm-hmm. So you start in the same way that a medical director or a nursing director knows what's going on quality wise across the organization. In fact, the person that's building this database has built quality databases for doctors and the chief nurse in the organization. It's exactly the same model. You build it, you challenge people, it's real-time data, and you try to have OD solutions, but evidence ones of the sort that I've talked about. And then you supplement it with other things. So in one trust, I mentioned this in passing, and I didn't realize it'd been picked up. I then was told by somebody and then checked it. The chief exec, I said, when leaders randomly check on what's going on, behavior changes. So this chief exec is white, a white man, randomly, occasionally rings up senior people who've been involved in appointment panels and says, I've just noticed the last 4 people you appointed are white men. Could you talk me through that? You don't want a second phone call from the chief executive about it. Mm-hmm. And what's been happening is everybody's been picking up the phone and saying, bloody hell, I've just had on the phone, we're being looked at. Particularly when you start to control access to development opportunities in a much fairer way, you start to challenge people about what's happening in the interview process. People put too much emphasis on the interview process. In effect, the decisions are taken before the interview process by the opportunities that people have had. But you can still check. So again, in that trust, and there's others that do it, if you don't appoint someone from an underrepresented group, primarily women, disabled, or BME people who are good enough to be shortlisted, you have to set out in writing why you didn't appoint them and what steps you're going to make sure happen so they get the development opportunities they do better next time. And that is checked upon. As well as having to explain why you made the decision you did. The cumulative effect of all that creates a climate in which people start to change their behaviors. There's still one last challenge, which is the frontline managers. And my view is, as far as possible, you engage with frontline managers. You should try to change their behavior without beating them up. But at the end of the day, this is how it's going to happen. And those informal, you won't ever get rid of some of the informal stuff, but you check on the outcomes. I'm not interested in what you say you're doing. The outcomes say it's not happening. So it's going to change and it's going to become something significant in your career. Otherwise, what you end up doing is you put lots and lots of emphasis on changing how mentorship and coaching and all those sorts of things done. They can be helpful. But if you don't deal with those other issues, actually what happens is people say, I'm not staying here. I'm going to go somewhere else. And people do. Why would they stay? And
I really, like I said, part of me is really kind of disappointed that we have to kind of put real levers and pressure on people to get them to change. But if we didn't, then this would be sorted by now. People would, because the argument about actually you should be a good person, you should treat people fairly, has been made, but that hasn't affected people's behaviours. And some of it is because it's not, they're not aware of their biases, but really nowadays you should be getting aware of your biases as well. But if that's what we have to do, if we have to have that, you are being watched. And when you don't do what we expect you to do, we want to understand why, and you're going to have to justify why, makes a lot more sense than we've got a black person on the interview panel, so they are now the custodians of making sure that everything's fair.
It's not unfair. It's not fair to them to be in that position, and it won't work. So there's two levels of accountability. There's accountability within an organization, and that should lie with the board and doing the sorts of things I've described. And then there's accountability in the system, which I think has been really poor. So we've had, you can have a really poor res data. There are no obvious consequences. The number of times the CQC has downgraded a trust in its well-led domain because it's rubbish at race equality, I'm not even sure it's ever happened. If it has, it's only happened once or twice. There are conversations going on at the moment about seriously beefing that up. And as far as NHS England is concerned, it's in the standard contract. You have to do the res, but there are no other consequences from NHS England. If you behave really poorly if your outcomes are really poorly on race, and dare I say, at the risk of upsetting anybody from NHS England who's listening, it's not helped by the fact that NHS England itself doesn't model the behaviours we expect of others. I've lost count of the number of times that people have suddenly appeared in senior positions at NHS England without any obvious, without even a job advert. And somebody who's recently been appointed to a job there said, I only got the job because I know the person who appointed me. And I think that's true across the arm's length bodies. There are people at very senior level who understand that and want to change it. But that's got to change as well. So NHS England need to think about what the consequences are. The CQC needs to beef up what the consequences are. I don't mean it just in terms of beating people up, but in terms of saying this is important. It affects patient care. It affects staff retention, the use of talent. We're in a staffing crisis at the moment. I was in one trust recently, where they lost 41% of staff within 2 years of starting. And much of that is about how staff are treated, not just on race, but generally how staff are treated. So we have to get this right. And NHS England, we're losing 1 in 9 nurses last year. What is that about? Well, we know what it's about. It's about overwork, not being respected, not being treated properly, can't cope anymore, stress, and things like race. That's why there's more BME people, for example, working for agency, because you can to some degree choose who you're working for at great cost to the NHS. So national leaders, and some of them really do want to do stuff about this, but I'm not convinced all do, need to get a grip on this. And they also need to stop engaging in things that are performative rather than evidenced.
Yeah. And we've got a couple of minutes left, but before we kind of wind up, I just want to pick up on a comment that I think Nina has made around that social capital that you have if you're straight, cis, white male and things. And back in May, we did an event around power and privilege and used the wheel of power and privilege. And I really recommend people go back and listen to that or watch that, because it really shows how very few of us actually sit at the area of disadvantaged in every element of our life. I, for example, never hit disadvantage being light-skinned Black and being straight and cisgendered. I just, I don't have that. I'm marginalized to an extent, but never hit that outer layer. And I found that wheel in particular and that discussion to be really useful when I'm talking with white colleagues, and particularly white male colleagues, to explain what we know, what we mean when we say privilege, and how power then comes with that. And you may not have that in every aspect of your life, but in certain contexts, and particularly in the workplace, it really has a massive impact.
I've never ever turned up for a job interview where there wasn't at least one white man on the interview. I could give lots of other examples, and people don't think about it. I think people are thinking about it a bit more than they used to, but white people like myself are still defensive when challenged about these things. Yeah. So I'm in favor of, where you can, challenging. My dad had a phrase: speak softly, carry big stick. Speak softly, but then you may have to back it up. But there have to be consequences eventually. People need to understand these things, but it's much better if you can at least start by trying to engage in a conversation around it, but recognizing you may have to step back and say, sorry, that's not acceptable. And for example, senior jobs, why isn't inclusion an absolute requirement? It's not just another aspect you scored on. If you're no good on inclusion, you're going to be no good as a very senior manager. So don't appoint them.
Absolutely. And I know our integrated care board has appointed a director of EDI at a senior level and had a lot of pushback over that decision. And I think even GB News decided that they were going to pile on when that went out to advert. But the chief exec there has been really clear about this is important, and therefore we need somebody who is a strategic leader to take that forward. So I can't wait to meet the person who's been appointed to that role. Roger, we are almost out of time. It's flown by. Thank you again so much for your time and your experience. It would be great if afterwards some of the research papers that you've shared, if you would share them with me, and then I can share them with people that have been on the call today. And also, one of the questions I'm asked frequently is, where do you know that's doing this well? So next time I get asked that on Twitter, I'm going to tag you in, because you've obviously got some really good examples of places that are doing it well. And it's something that a lot of us struggle with because we just don't know.
And as a final comment, in the paper I've just done about recruitment and career progression, I've complained bitterly that it really is about time we had a proper system for identifying and then sharing good practice around EDI. It's astonishing we don't have it. It's all kind of word of mouth, and you don't really know how good it is. We need not whether somebody thinks it works. If you can't explain why it's worked, why do we think it could be replicated at scale? Yeah. We're not doing that.
And as I said in the board last week, this is not, yes, it's an individual issue and it's about individual impact on people, but actually it's a quality and safety issue as well. Because if people don't feel safe to speak out, they won't. If people don't think they'll be heard, they won't bother talking about things. And if we're not getting that diversity of background and experience and everything, we're not identifying where we've got groupthink or where we could be doing better. So to me, this is not just it's a nice humanitarian thing to do. It is absolutely at the root of quality and safety. So, yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Just for the sake of people that are listening, as ever, if you can like and subscribe, that would be great. It does help with directing people to the content. We've got more Black All Year lined up for the rest of the year. I'm just waiting to confirm dates. So if you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll get information as to when they go live as well. I hope everybody has a great Black History Month and a great year, because yeah, we're Black all year, aren't we? But thank you again, Roger. It's been wonderful, and take care, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. Cheers.